Pope Leo XIV has been in place for 4 months now.
And already people are starting to wonder what direction his papacy will take.
He's made some encouraging gestures, talking about justice, peace, and welcome.
But the question remains, what will his leadership actually mean, especially for LGBTQ Catholics and others who've been marginalized in the church?
In this episode, we'll take stock of Pope Leo's first 4 months and explore what his early moves tell us about his papacy.
Join us as we ask, is this really the start of a new chapter or just more of the same? And what does it mean for a pope or for Catholics to be performative allies? And what does it mean for the pope and others to move and push beyond it?
Welcome to Whiplash with Maxwell Kuzma,
the show where two queer Catholics, Max and Emma, dive into the dark and twisty Catholic faith we were handed.
and the beautiful mess we're building in its place.
It's a journey of exploration, excavation, and deconstruction.
As we challenge the limited view of God we were taught,
An embrace of fully affirming, expansive Catholic faith.
no topic is off limits and no question is too big or too small.
We're in this together, figuring out how to reconcile our queerness with our Catholicism, and maybe, just maybe, even reimagine them both.
So buckle up, folks. We might experience a little whiplash, but we're here for the ride.
Let's go!
Well, Emma, it has been very eventful. And when I say that, we could unpack that in so many different directions. There's been a lot going on in the world, including the trailer for the new Knives Out movie, Wake Up Dead Man, just came out. You just showed it to me to much fanfare.
Absolutely. Not that I'm too gosh darn excited, but I love a murder mystery when I see one. And as we see, it feels like there's going to be something related to religious control, at least related to Glenn Close and Josh Brolin in this upcoming film set for release on December 12th.
And it's like here's the Venn diagram of our interests. And
It's a circle.
literally. So, but additionally, there's been a lot happening in the Catholic world, in Rome specifically. So Pope Leo XIV recently celebrated 4 months as Pope, which is a really big deal. And then, of course, the big Jubilee pilgrimage, which included an LGBTQ event of pilgrims on the Vatican page. There was a little caveat, there was a little asterisk of we don't necessarily support these, we're just listing out what they are, which kind of speaks to, I think, what we're going to be talking about today in this episode, which is kind of like, where are we with some of these things? Like, what do we know? What do we not know? Like, what are still question marks? So a few of my cursory thoughts before Emma sets the scene a little bit more fully with her history hat, which I always really appreciate. Some of my thoughts are, first, I think one of the most interesting things is still the question of where is Pope Leo going to land on certain subjects? Because within the same news of this historic LGBTQ opportunity to be physically present in this Jubilee, there's also been reporting that Pope Leo is allowing a traditionalist mass. I think it's like championed by Cardinal Burke, like he's like involved in making this particular event happen. So that's an example, just like one really simple example of like, okay, so it kind of feels like there's a little bit of both sides going on here, where it's like, okay, we're going to have the LGBTQ people, but we're like not going to officially, promote them. At the same time, we're going to let the Latin Mass people do their thing. So I think that's like my overall vibe or my overall take on like kind of the lay of the land. We'll obviously go into deeper examples, but yeah, if I had to start anywhere, that's kind of where I would say that we are. What do you think, Emma?
I agree. It feels like, especially for Pope Leo, who walked into an interesting state of the church. So for someone who is stepping very much into the shoes of Pope Francis, who's been not a perfect pope, but one that has been radically more inclusive and intentional than previous popes, Pope Leo is trying to thread the needle in an increasingly schismatic church of traditionalist factions that in some ways are more increasingly aligning themselves with far-right political circles and movements throughout the world, not just in the United States, but also with growing push similar to what was happening before the Second Vatican Council and what's been happening for 50 years of people trying to realize what an inclusive and welcoming church can look like in a world that is progressively changing, hopefully changing for the better and for more inclusivity of LGBTQ plus people. So setting the stage a little bit, I am very excited to talk about this. So back in December of last year, so not fully a year ago, the Italian LGBTQ plus group, La Tienda di Giannata, Jonathan's Tent, announced plans for an LGBTQ plus pilgrimage for the Jubilee year. As you might expect, that was well received by many LGBTQ plus Catholics that for the first time saw Vatican recognition of their role and place outside of harmful messaging that they've received, including Dignitas Infinita and other comments that were made by Francis and earlier popes. But at the same time, there was also the reaction from traditionalists and conservative Catholics that felt very upset that there was this acknowledgement. So the pilgrimage with the theme of Church, a Home for All, LGBTQ plus Christians and other existential foreigners, draws on the theme of the Jubilee Mass itself, of Pilgrims of Hope. So the Jubilee was held on September 6th and continued on throughout this week. So La Tienda de Giannata invited, quote, all associations and groups dedicated to supporting LGBTQ plus individuals and their families to join us as we officially cross the holy door of the Jubilee at St. Peter's Basilica. So it was an interesting and important moment for many LGBTQ plus Catholics, but one that was, just as you say, caveated. So while it represents a significant step, a spokesperson for the Vatican shortly thereafter in the Jubilee office confirmed that it's not a formal Jubilee event sponsored or organized us after the announcement of the program appeared on the Vatican's website. So despite pushback, including pilgrimage details initially being taken down from the Vatican's Jubilee website in mid-December and then being republished in the same week, the organization said the event holds space for LGBTQ plus Catholics to come as they are, and for other Catholics to see people, queer people especially, as vital members of the church and full members of their ecclesial community. It's an interesting step, and I also want to ground this in the fact that when Pope Leo became Pope this past spring, there was a great deal of investigation, especially by media, of any piece of discussing LGBTQ plus identity and communities in his past. In full transparency, a lot of the comments that he's made align with Pope Francis, who prior to being brought to the position of Pope had expressed extremely, sometimes damaging comments and ideas surrounding LGBTQ plus identity. And full transparency, even though Pope Francis did call LGBTQ plus Catholics by our name, he was still instrumental in Dignitas Infinita, a document that openly stood against the existence of trans, intersex, and non-binary Catholics and denied the importance of gender-affirming care as suicide prevention. So it was a difficult path, understanding what his legacy was in meaning for many queer Catholics that were devastated by his loss, but also understood that if somebody was going to take his place moving forward, they would have to work with this small crack that he generated in the church. So Pope Leo coming to the stage has had an interesting first 4 months, just as you say. So specifically, he in July appointed Father Thomas Hennon as bishop of the Diocese of Baker, Oregon. Specifically, who has been involved in LGBTQ plus ministry. One of his first bishop appointments in the United States being one that affirms LGBTQ plus ministry and this person's value. In the same way, while the Pope will not be present to meet with the pilgrims from this organization, he has indicated, based on his conversation in the past couple weeks with Father James Martin, that he is supportive of an open, welcoming church. So he is based on his conversation and what he shared with Father James Martin. Um, Father Martin, was told that Leo intended to continue Pope Francis's policy of LGBTQ plus acceptance in the church. Martin also encouraged him to keep up with his advocacy. Martin saying, "I heard the same message from Pope Leo that I heard from Pope Francis, which is the desire to welcome all people, including LGBTQ plus people. It was wonderful. It was very consoling and very encouraging, and frankly, a lot of fun." Love that from Father Martin. But with that being said, it represents a shaky, but in some ways, middle of the road approach to starting off the first 4 months. Just as you had mentioned as well, just reported today, Cardinal Raymond Burke will celebrate a traditional Latin Mass in St. Peter's Basilica on October 25th, in a signal that the Vatican, under Pope Leo, is still allowing this to continue moving forward, although there is still continued restrictions around the practice of the traditional Latin Mass. At the same time, Pope Leo has also affirmed, shortly after he was brought into the position of Pope, that a family is based on the union between a man and a woman, and that homosexual acts, again, problematic terminology, outdated terminology, is intrinsically disordered. So it's a mixed bag legacy that more than anything signals that he is still finding his footing on where he falls. But this new pilgrimage that was released is at least a sign that there are LGBTQ plus Catholics outside of Vatican authority, outside of Vatican recognition, that are pushing for space and recognition.
I think it's interesting, the news of Pope Leo meeting with Father James Martin, definitely coincided with the pilgrimage, which makes sense because Father Jim was in Rome for the pilgrimage. But it's an interesting contrast, I think. This visual of all these pilgrims who are wearing shirts that have like rainbow hearts or rainbow expressions on them. The contrast of that with a private meeting with Father Jim. But also, I think it is noteworthy that this all is going on, because kind of what I was thinking is like Pope Leo can't really take credit for this pilgrimage because it was set up and like allowed to go through before he even was Pope, before Pope Francis died.
I also want to put credit where credit's due, is that in talking about this conversation, it wasn't something that Pope Francis founded or Pope Leo was instrumental in doing. Arguably, the Vatican had conflicting and a really, in many ways, harmful response to push back against this LGBTQ plus moment and experience during the Jubilee celebration, of taking details down, then putting them back up, and racking with how much official recognition are we going to provide based on where we are in terms of theologically. But it's very much Catholics, queer and trans Catholics, that are holding their feet and holding their space in a church that's still figuring out where they are.
Yeah, I guess when I look at the lay of the land or the landscape right now for LGBTQ Catholics, I don't think it's reducible to easy headlines or easy sound bites. And I think, in the time of Pope Francis, there was just so much about Pope Francis that was so different. I mean, who am I to judge him saying that about gay people? Like, that was really groundbreaking, like very newsworthy. And also the images and the visuals and the pastoral nature of Pope Francis to always be wanting to embrace someone, whoever is there, whoever is his neighbor in that moment, he wants to embrace and love that person. And also, I've talked about this before, but with his like his cultural background, just that big warm personality, I think that contrasted so much as well with Pope Benedict, who was maybe a little more icy in a lot of ways.
That's a
So
gentle way to put it.
so there's a lot of like layered aspects here. I will say I'm not particularly thrilled with people who are quick to either pull Pope Leo into their team without like it just being 4 months. Like, they're like, he's a champion for our side, and I'm like, first of all, he's only been the Pope for 4 months, and second of all, like, I don't really think he's gonna be a Pope who is like a champion for one side or the other. Like, I think he is showing us that he intends to be very balanced. He intends to be, I mean, honestly, like a little status quo, you know, because as you alluded to in some of your earlier comments, like, the Pope isn't interested in a schism, and there's a lot of very intense divisiveness happening right now in the church, especially in the American Catholic Church. There's so much to say about all of that. Coming back to the pilgrimage, I do think, like I said, that this pilgrimage is very important. Obviously, it is historical. It also speaks to something that we did discuss in one of our episodes. I think I think at the election of Pope Leo, when we made a podcast episode about that, we talked about how world pride was in Rome, and then during the time of Pope Benedict, is that right? Was it Pope Benedict or was it Pope John Paul II?
World Pride was held in Rome in July 2000 as the first international event of its kind, coinciding with the Vatican's Great Jubilee.
So was it Pope
Pope
John
John
Paul?
Paul
Okay.
famously called the event, quote, an offense to the Christian values of a city that is so dear to the hearts of Catholics.
Yeah. So the fact that in the year 2000, the World Pride was being held in Rome at the same time as a Jubilee year, and Pope John Paul II called it an offense. I think that the fact that we now have had two popes who basically, because Pope Francis was around when this pilgrimage was pitched, and they had that waffling that you talked about where they like briefly took it down and then put it back up, and but then we have Pope Leo and he left it alone. That is huge progress for not that much time from 2000 until this year, 2025. And not that again, not that any of these individual things represents this amazing progress. We still have all these other issues, and not to put too much on this, but I have seen a lot of senior members of longtime LGBTQ Catholic ministries, such as New Ways Ministry and Dignity USA, which I am affiliated with as a board member, um, who have attended these events, who have both like been groups that have experienced a lot of like anti LGBTQ sentiment from the church. In the case of Dignity, being having the group being thrown out of Catholic churches, and Francis DiBarnito, the executive director of New Ways Ministry, like his comments that were shared on the New Ways social media page, he talked. I actually want to just read his quote. Um,
Yeah.
it's three paragraphs here, but I think it really shows like what this pilgrimage has meant to a lot of people, especially like I say, these older long-standing organizations. So he says, one of the things I remember most about that time, so in 2000 when World Pride was happening, was the anger expressed by the Vatican and the Pope himself that World Pride was taking place in Rome during the Jubilee year. The mood in the city was incredibly tense. Vatican anti gay rhetoric had fueled hateful sentiment beyond the Catholic Church. Many right wing Italian political groups were denouncing World Pride, which was to culminate in a march from the Porta San Paolo to the Colosseum. Anti gay messages were plastered all over the city buildings. One message in particular remains strong in my memory. Um, it was written in Italian, but it said, "Gays at the Colosseum? Yes, with the lions." The Vatican, in fact, tried to persuade the city of Rome not to allow World Pride or its march to take place. It did not succeed. 25 years later, openly LGBTQ plus people were now about to walk through the Holy Door at St. Peter's. The fact that the Vatican this time was welcoming such a pilgrimage shows how much the church has grown in regard to accepting LGBTQ plus people, from repression and exclusion to welcome and accompaniment. The Mass at the Church of the Jesu was brimming with joy. The excitement reminded me of the LGBTQ plus equality marches in the US in the later part of the 20th century. Everyone was so happy to be there, and, as was appropriate for the Jubilee year's theme, all in attendance were filled with hope. End quote from Frank. Yeah, so that that message, I think, honestly meant more to me than even hearing that, Pope Leo met with Father Jim, because that is a message by someone who has been LGBTQ Catholic his whole life and has lived through all of this history and has seen like the tides. And even though, we can look at it and be critical, which I think we should be, and say it's not enough and that the church could do more to be welcoming and show that LGBTQ people are fully included. um, I think it means a lot to me that elder members of the community who have lived through this history see this as and got to participate in this pilgrimage in such an important way. Like, I think them being able to see kind of like the tide of history turn in that way, I think is really important. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Absolutely. And I think an important thing to talk about is that queer activism and inclusion have been key parts of Catholic pastoral care for decades. So you highlight dignity, but along with New Ways Ministry, the global network of Rainbow Catholics, outreach, the rich history of gender and sexual diversity within the Catholic Church, and Pope Francis holding space to greet and speak with LGBTQ plus Catholics and queer pilgrims over the past 25, 50 years really speaks to the idea that even if there is not official church recognition, there is a record of engaging with diversity of gender and sexuality within the history of the church, despite a push towards more traditional and conservative leanings within the last 300 years. So to bring listeners to this conversation up to speed about Pope Francis and his track record, so we can put in context Pope Leo's. Pope Francis greeted LGBTQ plus pilgrims from the UK in 2019, and the Vatican Synod Office listed New Ways Ministries resources on their websites. Although similar to the Jubilee, it was temporarily removed and later restored, with apologies from the General Secretariat of the Synod of Bishops in 2023. New Ways Ministry itself met twice with Pope Francis to brief him on LGBTQ plus issues. On the second visit, New Ways staff brought members of the transgender and intersex communities with them to speak directly with the Pope. And Pope Francis greeted trans men and women during general audiences in St. Peter's Square, including Max, you as well. So I think speaking about the idea that queer Catholics have been in conversation a great deal about this. Go ahead, Max.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I feel like I always forget to mention that. By the way, yes, I did meet Pope Francis.
No, but I think it's important because it's one of those things where we have talked about and encountered comments on videos talking about LGBTQ plus history within Catholicism, something we'll delve into in the October series about how you can't be a Catholic person. You can't be a person of faith because you are trans. And so talking about the idea that Pope Francis actually, as an indicative of his inclusive ministry and his willingness to meet people where they were and in person, to have those conversations really represents you being able to meet him in person and him welcoming you into that space.
100%. And I really liked how you phrased a record of engaging with. So regardless of kind of how it shakes out or what happens, like, yes, that really did happen. I really did shake the Pope's hand and tell him in Spanish, his native language, that I'm a transgender man, and he didn't freak out. So yeah, no, 100%. I think it's very important too.
Absolutely. And I also want to highlight, just as you said, that Father James Martin encouraged people with this idea that Pope Leo was open to the expectation, as I shared earlier, to engaging with and continuing Francis's legacy. So specifically in a piece that was written for Outreach, the organization that Father James Martin helped to found, he writes, "But let me address what many people want to know, Pope Leo's approach to LGBTQ plus Catholic ministry. The message I received from him, loud and clear, was that he wanted to continue with the same approach that Pope Francis had advanced, which was one of openness and welcome. So it was very much a hopeful message of continuity. This is, in Pope Leo's mind, naturally tied to synodiality. The idea that the church must listen to people from all walks of life, including LGBTQ plus people, to become more open, more listening, more welcoming, and more inclusive. Again, this is very much in line with Pope Francis's desires and his famous words, todos, 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 to describe the church. This is also in line with Leo's public embrace of synodiality, not simply as a synod delegate, but as a pope whose very first speech after his election mentioned what is now a constitutive dimension of the church. I also think it's important to highlight that, as you say, Pope Leo is threading a very delicate line because, as we've seen, not just especially in the last year, but in the past 5 years, I think there's been a mobilization, as we talked about in our Catholic nationalism episode, of far right Catholics that have been pulled into the sphere of extremely far right conservatives in the United States. So before, where we saw maybe a distancing between Catholics and other far right Christians and Republicans, there's been a mobilization of young Catholic people, including many young Catholic converts and converts to Orthodoxy, that have found a place not only in a more traditionalist church that's at odds with the changing world, but also that have found champions not only and sometimes not necessarily in Pope Leo and Vatican leaders, but in American political leaders, which is especially troubling.
I'm really glad that you bring that up too. Yeah, like weaving in the implications politically for the world like has to happen. I mean, especially in light of the fact that the Vatican is a famously not political place at all, right, Emma?
What? No. I will say, I do want to highlight, Max, that one of the key moments, actually, once Pope Leo was elected to be Pope, was not only going through his past track record of talking on LGBTQ plus issues, but also his past track record engaging with Trump and far right
Yes,
political leaders here in the United States. So he has
100%.
gone blow to blow in terms of Trump and uplifting pieces that were openly critical of the president and vice president.
I'm glad you bring that up. Some old tweets from old Robbie Prevost or Bobby. I don't know which one you use for Robert. Maybe both.
It's a
Um,
good question. It 100% is.
I had to had to put a little dad joke spin on it, but
Love it.
no, I in some ways actually I think it's interesting too because to me like some of the language or that track record of sharing he had shared on his official Twitter account, I believe his X account, about articles that were critical of JD Vance and Trump, like you said. And to me, in some ways, that's like almost like a little bit more forceful than he's been now that he has been Pope. Wouldn't you agree with that, Emma?
I agree, but I will be honest, that's not necessarily everyone's views. So, Christopher Hale,
Oh,
who led National Catholic Outreach for President Obama's reelection campaign and served as co founder of Catholics for Harris, wrote an opinion piece shortly, well, actually, not shortly, in on June 19th, 2025, titled Pope Leo is Shaping Up to be Trump's Most Effective Moral Opponent.
well, yeah. I will say some of Christopher Hale's he's a little enthusiastic, is what I would
He's a
say.
little excited.
He named his Substack letters from Leo, right? And I think it's kind of this. I see a lot of content from him, Christopher Hale, that's like he's out there, he's amazing, he's doing all this stuff, which I think is a little it's a little enthusiastic.
And
um,
that's why I wanted to bring it up purely for this reason, is that I don't necessarily agree with with what Hale is saying here, but I think it's important to note that this represents one end of a spectrum of thinking about Leo. That
totally.
in our discussions, we encounter some members of the media and some members of Catholic communities, especially progressive Catholics, that are quick to love and attach to any semblance of progressiveness and liberalism that they hear from Pope Leo. Kind of how when Pope Leo was first elected, anything that he did, breathing, going on vacation, engaging with anyone, was seen as some of the first indications of what this new Pope, an American Pope, would mean. But at the same time, we see not only this enthusiasm, but also this retraction of from like conservative and traditionalist Catholics, people expressing a lot of hesitancy about especially the Jubilee pilgrimage of what does this mean for us moving forward in terms of the church recognizing LGBTQ plus Catholics.
100%. I mean, also on Substack, you can find many traditionalists, but I mean, they're essentially sedevacanists. Like, if you look at the comments on the post that these publications make, so they'll write a whole thing about how like ungodly and antichrist it is that these things are allowed to happen, and then you look in the comments, it's like, well, and it's important to remember that Pope Leo is not a validly ordained pope. And we're like, aha. So you're not actually really being very Catholic if that's kind of where you're going with this. But yeah, I think another issue or another thing I wanted to highlight is there are voices who are still cautious. So for example, Sister Janine Gramick, who is also associated with, of course, New Ways Ministry as a co founder. She, in the Global Sisters report on September 4th, so 5 days ago as of this recording, she published Sister Janine Gramick asks, will actions affirm Pope Leo's words on LGBTQ people? So she's reflecting on the early days of Pope Leo XIV's papacy with both gratitude and guarded hope, especially for LGBTQ Catholics. She celebrates his continuity with Pope Francis in promoting justice, peace, and welcome, while also urging him to move beyond words to actions that affirm the dignity and safety of LGBTQ plus people worldwide, which I would also agree with because, again, you know, having that opportunity to hold the Pope's hand and look in his eyes and have him say to me, or like, yeah, to have him welcome me, as I said to him, I'm transgender, and to see his reaction that he wasn't recoiling, that action spoke really strongly. So I really agree with her there. And then going on in her article, drawing on her decades of ministry, she underscored the urgency of reforming harmful church language, which is huge. That's something that I think the LGBTQ Catholic community should organize around, is this idea of let's actually make a request. I get a little bit burnt out from all these opportunities for welcome, but not like substantive change. So I would love to see us all start asking, hey, we are seeing this welcome. You let us do this pilgrimage. Can you please remove this concept of intrinsically disordered? It's like discriminatory and isn't respectful of our human dignity. So I really agree with the idea of changing harmful language. And then she also underscored the importance of synodality, as Emma touched on, the issue of synodality and where that all lands as a path towards change. Somebody that I am friends with, who is an older progressive Catholic who came up during post Vatican II. I was asking her just kind of on the side of what do we think of Leo? I kind of implied that I felt like he was kind of playing both sides a little bit, like he's still kind of in the middle. And she said, I will be waiting to see what happens in 3 years at the synod. She said she thinks that's his like time to prove himself. So that would be interesting. I'm just going to end and hand it back to Emma after I do one last quote from Sister Janine's essay, which I think is very important, which is, our church, indeed our whole world, needs to be a place of discussion and dialogue where everyone can feel free to share their experiences and their truth. And I will say, having known Sister Janine and seeing her as a kind of mentor in a lot of ways within the space of LGBTQ Catholic advocacy, that's very true to her. She is a strong believer in the power of a person's individual story as an LGBTQ person and being able to share that. Emma and I obviously echo and agree with this importance of lived experience. We share those lived experience pieces on our Substack alongside our long deep dives on purpose, because the lived experience matters. It's not just that these things happened, it's also that people experienced them.
Absolutely. And I also want to highlight what you said that I think is important is that Pope Leo is stepping into a church following Pope Francis. Pope Francis being someone that, as I shared before, has made numerous mistakes. Pope Francis was involved in Dignitas Infinita. Pope Francis said the same slur, referring to gay priests twice um, behind closed doors. So that we know of. So holding an accountability that those moments were moments of human fault, were moments of harm to the LGBTQ plus community. But at the same time, Pope Francis was intentional about the actions that he took. So not only meeting with you, Max, and other trans individuals, but also enjoying conversations with and engaging with people in their own space, in his space, and welcoming in and having that dialogue was important. So whether it was eating pasta with a trans woman in the Vatican City, whether it was engaging and talking with the parents of LGBTQ plus children, speaking with LGBTQ plus Catholic leaders, including Father James Martin and others, about what can be done. His actions said a lot more than the words that he did. Even though his words caused harm, his actions spoke to a goal to infect and create change within the church. So I think it's important, and I want to highlight what you said, Max, that I think there's often there, and one thing that we highlight that I think many young LGBTQ plus Catholics bring to the conversation, not to say that older LGBTQ plus Catholics are not wonderful mentors and advocates, but that many of us see a goal and want to see change and ignited and change witnessed during our lifetime. So many of us acknowledge that the church is slow to change, but at the same way, spaces and words of welcome cannot be enough. For many of us, the traditions and the legacies of harm that we have experienced, that these mentors have experienced, cannot be the final word on this conversation, nor can words of welcome and affirmation be enough. So if it means first starting out, as Sister Janine Gramick talks about, of removing that harmful language, if it means acknowledging the jubilee that is happening right now in the church, if it means holding and creating space for further dialogue with LGBTQ plus Catholics, I am more encouraged by specific actions towards inclusion rather than words of inclusion that we hear. And I am hopeful that many young queer and trans Catholics are pushing not just for words of affirmation and reparative work within the church of removing that harmful language, apologizing for legacies of harm and violence, but also taking steps to open the door even further. So even though Francis very much died with his foot stuck in the door of trying to pry it open, I'm hopeful that Pope Leo will keep pushing.
Yeah, 100%. No, and I think all of what you say is really important too and vital. It's hard for us, I think, as people who not only have participated in much LGBTQ advocacy, but also are writers and thinkers more widely within a Catholic ecosystem. I think it's hard for us to kind of like remove ourselves from that context and also remove ourselves from the awareness of the history, not just because Emma is a historian, so she's always doing her deep dives, but also because, it's what we live and breathe in a lot of ways. We're deeply immersed in looking at the patterns and the trajectories of different movements and things across history of the church. And I think that's why it's a little bit hard for us to kind of look at these things as like, I'm thinking of like a pilgrim who on one of these pilgrimage, like in this pilgrimage, literally in this pilgrimage in Rome right now, I'm thinking of what that experience must be like the awe of wearing a rainbow shirt and walking through, um, walking boldly into the Catholic Church and knowing that that's not something that you're going to be get in trouble for, like, because that's the other thing is that, especially in the U.S. context, which we are embroiled in, it's a culture war ethos. Like, it's all culture war. If you look at the history of the American Catholic Church, it begins with a culture war. It begins with, hi, we're here. Oh, you guys are all Puritans. How do we fit in? Like, what do we do? Like, are you guys gonna like burn all of us? So there's culture war stuff from the beginning. And then even I think I was gonna say earlier too, I think that a lot of the people who want to cast Pope Leo as the answer to Trump. I think that is just a reductive culture war thinking again, as if, the embodiment of these figureheads, essentially, like someone who is in charge of America, the president, and someone who's in charge of the Catholic Church, they're both American. So now they're going to go head to head or something like that is just unrealistic to what actually takes place, and what actually is experienced again. So I think by the average people. So I think that I'm I'm feeling all of those things simultaneously. I'm holding this layered view of the history that we are deeply immersed in. I am appreciating the role of the leaders like Sister Janine, like Marianne Duddy Burke from Dignity, who was present, like the leaders from the Global Network of Rainbow Catholics, etc. And I'm holding the feelings of those individual gay Catholics who walked on the pilgrimage, imagining myself like how I felt when I met Pope Francis. I'm sure they felt something similar, no, not on the same level, but something similar. This what this represents, and then I'm also just thinking about how none of these things exist in a vacuum from each other. They're within this enmeshed world of the culture war and what's going to happen. So I hope that didn't wander too much, but that's kind of how I see it.
No, and I agree. And I think it's important that you point out. I think the construction of Trump versus Leo, specifically the construction of Trump as a far right leader and a mobilizer of conservative and traditionalist Catholics versus Leo as potentially, again, we don't necessarily know, it's still early days, of a more inclusive and welcoming church, gives too much credit to Trump overall. Pope Leo is leading a global church, including a church that has other far right Catholic leaders embroiled and involved in this. Um,
Huge.
so it gives too much credit to the idea that globally the United States is leading all conversations about what it means to be a Catholic and what it means to be a traditionalist Catholic.
Because even to your point just there, even this pilgrimage was started by an Italian group.
Yep, 100%. And I also want to point out, I love how you say this, that thinking about what it would be like to actually be there during the pilgrimage. In full honesty, I wasn't able to be there during the pilgrimage, but I also want to recognize what it would feel like not to be in it. Not just for myself, but also for the fact that Sister Janine is talking about that the harm perpetrated by terminology like intrinsically disordered, the harm perpetrated by organizations that encourage and mobilize conversion therapy practices, a church that continues to uphold shame and guilt, that by necessity leads to and contributes to suicide and suicidality among LGBTQ plus youth and adults, means that there are a number of queer and trans people not walking through that door because of what the church has done. So while this is an
Yeah.
incredibly important step of people wearing rainbow shirts, wearing rainbow buttons, wearing rainbow banners, and that is significant and meaningful to many of us, especially elders in our community who have been fighting for decades for this work, it's important to acknowledge everyone who's not able to be here today, walking through those doors because of what the church has done, and the number of people who don't feel that that's an important step anymore, that
Yeah.
don't feel they have a stake in a church that still continues to debate and create distance between a jubilee that was founded by LGBTQ plus people. Because in my perspective, very much in the world that I live in right now, it seems to thread the needle in a much different way of we can still talk about this level of inclusion with this jubilee, even though the Vatican didn't create or mobilize for this action. So it offers a sense of welcome to this group at the same time that holding that professional distance from this group allows the church to maintain its stance. So it comes down to the idea of where are we going to take action where action is needed, and what action can we take not only to make reparative change that we can, but also to acknowledge and apologize for hurt.
Well said, Emma. It's definitely how do we go beyond performative allyship, and
Absolutely.
when we have an image of allyship, talking about the origins of it. Where did it come from? Whose labor made it happen, and who is taking credit for it? I'm picking up what you're putting down on that, and I think it's very important. And I also think that what you said about thinking of the people who are not there, I think that
Yeah.
is also incredibly important. Um, because yeah, and then yet another group I'm also thinking of is the traditionalists who are looking at it, who are flying off the handle about it, who post these really harmful things, and like I alluded to earlier, the traditionalists posting about it, and then all the people in the comments about like, well, he's not even the real pope who right now and all this stuff. But like, and that's just about the church, but there's plenty of stuff that is deeply harmful to LGBTQ people that comes about. So to your point, LGBTQ people were the ones who organized it, that put themselves on the line to create it, who are the actual participants, and then there's really no institutional safety net for those responses. Like all that negativity is being gonna be directed directly at them, and it's gonna be this idea that this is just a fad. This is just a one-time thing. It's because Pope Francis was not the real pope, and so we just have to get this over with so that the church history can advance on unblemished by anybody who's LGBTQ. Like that attitude, which is deeply harmful.
It begs two questions for me. So the first one being the question of, or rather the statement that similar to what is happening in the United States today, a lot of LGBTQ plus organizations, a lot of internal employee resource groups are the people that are bearing the brunt of risk and labor in terms of advocating for their communities and providing for them. And often it's a means of pointing to those groups and saying, look, we supported this group and therefore we've done the work. Just as you talk about a performative ally, when in essence they're not doing anything tangible or vocal or physically to support these groups. So I also want to highlight specifically Raquel Willis, a Black trans woman writer, editor, and activist, who specifically called out Sabrina Carpenter's VMA performance, including a number of drag queens. Specifically, the idea that what that was performative activism that mobilized a group of people that were especially vulnerable to violence right now. I also want to ask you the question, Max. First of all, for people who aren't familiar, what is a performative ally? And for Pope Leo, what would it mean to you for him to move, and what would he need to do to move beyond a performative ally?
Oh man, definitely some just easy questions there, Emma. Yeah, so I would say, as far as performative allyship goes, I don't have like a textbook definition off the top of my head. I'll just tell you what I think of when I hear that. I essentially think of someone who doesn't go beyond maybe a bumper sticker or something like that, where it's kind of like the idea of an allyship is like being a fan. Like if you're a fan of something, maybe you do have like a sticker, or maybe you write about it on your social media and you're like, I love K-pop. I love this K-pop band. Similarly, I love gay people. In and of itself, just standing alone without any actions associated with it, that can feel performative. Um, Actions tied to it would be amplifying the voices of the LGBTQ community. Making donations to LGBTQ organizations. So, yeah. So when I think performative, I think someone who has found a strategic way to position the idea that they are welcoming or affirming of LGBTQ people, but without like the actions that should accompany that.
I also want to parallel, I think that is an excellent definition. And we also call out performative allies not only within white, straight, heteronormative communities, but also within LGBTQ plus community itself.
Yes.
Um, Many white, cis, gay, and lesbian individuals use this idea of performative allyship to gain mobility and access to queer and trans spaces and credibility within these spaces when they're not doing anything tangible in terms of action to support the most vulnerable among their communities.
Or in fact, they individually may gain prominence, but they're not. They have not built an ethical structure that would actually honor all of the work that has been done by the community to get anyone to that point, because anybody who gets there is standing on people's shoulders, period. Like, there's no question. Nobody's coming out of a vacuum. And even if you don't know your history, you still aren't coming out of a vacuum.
And doesn't excuse you from not knowing your history or not knowing on whose labor and whose shoulders you stand.
100%. And so your next question was it specifically asking me um, what action I would want to see him take?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to repeat it. And honestly, I want to refine it a little bit following this definition. So, from my perspective, and I mean this in a gentle and mobilizing critique, that to me, I see Pope Leo as someone, by virtue of his position and by virtue of the reality he's living in, as someone who is navigating what it means to be a performative ally within the Catholic Church. Um, so, my question for you is, what would it look like? What steps can Pope Leo take and can mainline Catholics take to help move beyond being performative allies?
I remember when he was like very, very fresh, I was already starting to think in that direction. I didn't get very far at the time because I saw that he was already getting mired in this, all the adulation about him being American Pope. That really occupied so much airtime. It was just nonstop memes and all that stuff. But to cut through all of that, yeah, so I do think he does need to personally meet with LGBTQ people, even though Pope Francis already did it, and he should already be doing this. Like, this is like the bare minimum, I feel. But he really does need to hear like directly from LGBTQ people in a public facing way. Like, the public needs to know he's doing that work, because that's step one. But I think beyond that, I would love to see. I know that the synod, historically, some issues came up, issues around LGBTQ identity and issues around women's ordination, that were actually discussed in the synodal process at every level. Like, so for those who don't know, it starts on a local level, and there were listening sessions that would happen in dioceses across the world. And then those, listening sessions generate material that gets collected and passed up, and it keeps going up to different groups, and then at the like different levels. And then there's the actual synod, which has like the representatives that were assigned, like the official representatives, and then they do the same thing where they listen and talk through, and then I think after that they write a recommendation to the Pope of like, hey, we listened to everybody and here's what we think, and then it can go out. But there were issues that were omitted from that final document, and so to me, that's an injustice, that we should actually see some of those issues directly related to LGBTQ people, but those other things too, to actually be included, because I think that synodal process is, I think that is more fair and more true to what church should be. And I know that many traditionalists and you know, many people who are like, the church is the church and it's always been the church and it's never going to be anything different, would disagree with me. But I would say that those people don't know the history, because the church has moved in a lot of ways on a lot of different things. Like, you may
Council of
say,
Nicaea, anything?
yeah, there have historically been married bishops, married priests, married popes who had children. Like, we can talk about like whether or not that was ethically appropriate, but like the fact that it occurred at all, like it's not as if the church is like a capsule, a time capsule where nothing has ever changed. And I think that it's not only harmful to the real people that exist outside of these imaginary fixed points, but it's also basically setting the church up for failure in general on the global stage. Like, even if tomorrow Pope Leo shut down everything that was LGBTQ affirming and basically became the perfect traditionalist pope for those people, that's not a church that's actually going to go anywhere or accomplish anything positive, because closing down and shutting down the doors and bolting, fortifying is not a path to growth at all. And some people may be like, well, it matters where you grow too. Who wants to grow if it's outside the truth? And it's like, just simply, my position on that is, if God is love, then and we are all products of God's love, then God created this beautiful diversity, period. So like, he gave us this fullness of diversity to strengthen and enrich the human race. Like, he put all these different types of people in the world in order to all together create something beautiful like that. I mean, that to me is like the type of liberatory theology that is worth believing in, because that's so much more open, and actually leads us to grow and be able to improve as a human race. I'm probably a little way out there, Emma, but I really think that.
No, and I completely agree. And I think what you're talking about, the idea is that we are what it means to for me to go beyond being a performative ally is acknowledging that there is precedent for change and inclusion within the church. And I think more than anything, as someone who researches queer history, queer religious history, is acknowledging that by virtue of statistic, but also by virtue of hagiographies and key figures within the church, queer and trans people have been part of the fabric of the church, have been part of formulating and directing the church's growth and change over time ever since its beginning. So if traditionalists and conservative Catholics want to play the argument of, I want a historical church, I want a pure church, there will never be a church that's pure enough for them. And they don't want to learn the history, because the history is going to teach them about not only holding institutions accountable, we're talking about holding the church accountable for Christian boarding schools, colonialization, a great deal of harmful evangelical frameworks, the owning of other people, exploiting enslaved labor throughout the history of the church, financial abuses. But it also means reckoning with what that history can mean in terms of liberation of marginalized communities today and communities that are specifically targeted. So pointing out that, just as you say, there's precedent for this. And there's precedent not only, as Pope Francis talked about during his papacy, but hopefully for Pope Leo moving forward, if he remembers what this history looks like and remembers to, as I said before, push the door a little bit further open.
100%.
To anyone who is listening, please know also that the Jubilee that was experienced this year is a hopeful and inspiring moment, but it's also a moment of privilege. So we talked about the idea that that there are many people who are not able to walk through these doors physically because they have died by suicide, because they are struggling with self-harm, because they're just not here with us anymore, including because of systemic violence against the community through murder and outright discrimination, but also through lack of research and allocated resources for AIDS. But I also want to point out that for a number of us, actually walking physically through these doors is not financially feasible. So the majority of people who are able to partake in this movement, and many of whom are Italian and live in this area, but the majority of Americans who are able to walk through these doors, I hope understand and represent whose hopes they bring on their shoulders, but also that everyone listening knows that that is a privileged position that these people have to be able to be part of this moment in history, and that it doesn't necessarily mean that it is going to be the last time that LGBTQ plus Catholics walk through the doors of the church. I'm hoping that it'll just be a space where, again, pushing the doors open, and also creating that precedent that we talked about.
And also that it doesn't mean that you don't matter if you didn't get to walk through those doors.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that whatever door that you are walking through, whether it be the doors of a church in your space, the doors of a Catholic church, an Episcopal church, a space of worship that feels comfortable, or just an LGBTQ plus safe space or communal network, that to you is going to be as significant and important, and maybe even more impactful than walking through the doors in Rome. Pope Leo XIV's first 4 months have opened up a lot of questions and just a few answers.
We'll be keeping watch to see whether his words of welcome become real action, especially for those who've been left on the margins.
Thanks for joining us in this conversation. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and share it with a friend.
And as always, you can find us on Substack, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube.
We'll be back soon with more conversations on faith, power, and the future of the church.
Until then, take care and keep asking the big questions.
Goodbye!